Hey guys, it's Dasha. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Welcome to today's video, which is a wrap-up and review of everything I read in the month of May. Spoiler alert, it's a lot. In the month of May, I finished up quite a few books that I had started in previous months, so I kind of counted them into this because now I can give full thoughts. I also had a honestly fantastic reading month. I just had a lot of books that I loved this month. I did have one DNF, but overall there are a lot of things that I truly loved. So much so that it's hard for me to pick a favorite in my reading journal. You can see the video here where I set up the 2022 edition of my reading journal. I have a spread that's just like my favorite book of each month. I love doing it usually, but it was so hard for me to pick because there's just so much good stuff, and there's stuff that I read like a chunk of it in the month of April, so is it like really a favorite of May? But like it kind of is. So I'm just gonna go kind of in order of when I read it, more or less. I also, just spoiler warning, I also read mostly fantasy this month with like 2 to 3 nonfiction books. So if you're not interested in that kind of stuff, you might not be super interested, but I do think you should at least listen to the nonfiction recs because there are some fantastic things, and maybe I'll go ahead and start with those and then go into the fantasy. So without further ado, we're gonna scrap my usual order of least favorite to favorite. We're gonna start with the DNF and then go into nonfiction and then all of the fantasy. I think that's a good order. So grab a drink, grab a snack, let's get into this. The first book I want to talk about is of course the DNF, and that is Dancing Bears by Witold Szablowski. This is a nonfiction book. It is a set of short stories / interviews with people who have lived through tyrannical governments, namely communist governments. And it is supposed to be this comparison to these bears that were trained by Romani people in Bulgaria, and how basically once the bears were like liberated by animal rights peoples, whenever the bears would see people in their like enclosure, because they were all sent to this like animal habitat where they were able to be free to act like bears and live their best life as bears and not as like circus animals. Whenever the bears would see humans, they would still get on their hind legs and dance for them like they did when they were trained under the Romani. And the author is supposed to be drawing these parallels between these bears who had to be taught how to be free, how to be, how to give into their nature as bears, and people who were oppressed under communism and how they had to be basically taught how to be free and how to act as normal people would under a non-communist, non-tyrannical government. Almost spilled my wine. Unfortunately, I just didn't gel with this. The first half of this really small book was only about bears, and it was supposed to serve as a backdrop as well to some of the people who had lived in Bulgaria who trained these bears and kind of how they felt about it and how they felt nostalgic for this time when the government wasn't telling them what to do, when they had a little bit more freedom. There was this little period in between the communist time and the full, taking away their bears, full capitalist time. And they felt nostalgic for that era. And it was supposed to serve as basically a primer to the stories of the people. But even once I got into the part of the people, I just was ultimately really bored. I didn't like this framing structure. I felt like by the time you got through the whole bear part, it was really just draining. I felt like there was so much focus on these animal rights people who were just clearly blindsided by this like idealistic view of like we need to save the bears from people because the bear trainers had put like iron rings through the noses of the bears, but these people treated the bears like family. Ultimately, they let them sleep inside the house, they fed them food from the table, and they treated them like one of their own. When they were taken away, these people grieved them like it was a family member that was lost. The animal rights people were just kind of detestable in that they just felt very narrow-minded in terms of like the bears are wild, they need to be wild, so we're going to introduce them into this enclosure, but like we're not going to let them interact with the wild, we're still going to have to feed them and stuff. And it just felt like a very narrow view of the situation, and they were just like detestable people. They were really discriminatory towards the Romani people, and it was just not pleasant to read about. And I understand that was probably how the view was, but because this was framed in a way that was just like the interviews and no opinion, no narrative really, it was just kind of draining to read about. These people were not good people and it wasn't really pleasant to read about, and I understand that doesn't really make it bad. It's just not enjoyable for me personally. I felt like it wasn't something I really wanted to spend my time on. It felt like a slog every time I picked up this book. I got about 155 pages in, I think. No, I didn't. Did I even get that far? I did. Okay, no. I got like 100. Okay, I got like 130 pages in, but I just like, I was not feeling this at all. This was not for me. I might recommend it. Like, it's a short read. The premise is much more intriguing than the execution though, but if you enjoy more interview-based nonfiction that's kind of like short stories, little vignettes, I guess, of people's lives, this might be for you. But I just like, I truly was not feeling this. This was not the mood. I thought it would be like a super quick read, but it took me ages to pick it up and be back into it, and I just was not feeling this. So this was a very easy DNF for me. Luckily, the other 2 nonfiction books I actually finished this month were fucking fantastic. So the first of these I want to talk about is the one I've been reading since February, because it is a very dense book, but it was fantastic, and that is The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. This is the story of disaster capitalism, which her thesis basically states that disaster capitalism is the idea of coming in after a revolution or a natural disaster and quietly remaking the economic system of a country and selling it off to the highest bidders internationally to basically undermine the democratic process in the country. And this has manifested itself in several ways. This book has aged a little bit. This book was published in 2007, so it's a little bit irrelevant now. Okay, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but it is just, I wish there was more recent events in this book because it was just fascinating and I could have read it forever. It is very strongly arguing against like would you call it like Friedmanism? Milton Friedman's principles of economics, which is just like free market, unfettered capitalism. And even though I'm terrible with numbers in economics, I actually understood this quite well. I really, really enjoyed this. This is such a good look at how the process of democracy can be completely undermined and how situations that we think are like black and white aren't actually. I really also appreciated that this took many perspectives. It wasn't just this like South America. It wasn't just post communist Eastern Europe. There were so many different instances of this happening. This touched on Afghanistan and Iraq. This touched on, there was I think it was Indonesia after they had a tsunami. You know what, I'm gonna double check that. Anyways, I'm not going to find it right now, but there was tons of examples of where it was implemented, and it even touched on the US and how it was implemented in the US post Hurricane Katrina and in other instances in the US. Basically, it's the story of how not only did a lot of the world get bought out by multinational corporations and become completely undermined and their national economies ruined, but it was also an exploration of how the US war machine became what it is. It talks a lot about Lockheed Martin and a lot of the paramilitary groups. So if you're interested in that, I feel like this is a great introduction to it because it is a bit more historical and it looks at it from the economic angle, which I thought was super, super fascinating. It also taught me just a lot of things I didn't know. Obviously, a lot of us knew that there was a lot of problems with US intervention in foreign affairs, especially places like South America and the Middle East, but I also did not know that the US government played a very large role into making Poland and Russia what they are today. Basically, post-communist Russia was largely influenced by US foreign actors and World Bank people and the IMF people just coming in and basically like nudging them in the right direction, but it ended up creating this system of oligarchs that continues to oppress the majority of the Russian population and other countries. Like this has so many far-reaching consequences. This is the thing. This book has so many implications. Now that I've read it, I can see the little threads in all these other conflicts and situations today, and you can really see how this idea of unfettered capitalism has spread and just diseased everything it has touched. And it just feeds into this idea of American exceptionalism because they feel like they are the saviors. They're like, well, look what happened when we let these people manage themselves. It turned into a disaster. And it's like, no, the IMF and the World Bank, partially funded by the US, but also pushing the US interests, helped spread this rot in a lot of countries of corruption and this idea that for a nation to have a successful economy, it must be funded by international organizations and it must be not kept internal or closed and protected. It must be open for all, and that's caused immense poverty and suffering. So it was really interesting from that perspective. I could talk about this book all fucking day. I learned so much from it. I think you really need to read this personally to understand how the world is what it is today. I just think this was so impactful and really well argued, basically. I have seen reviews of people arguing that this was too extreme in its comparison of the like shock doctrine, this idea of like shock therapy to a country's economy. And comparing that to like shock therapy, like literally electrocuting people to change their perspective. I've seen a lot of people complain about that comparison because that is kind of the parallel she draws at the beginning, but that's really not the point of the book. The point is that she wants to illustrate how this coming in after a natural disaster or revolution where the people are already fragile mentally and proceeding to completely decimate their economy and sell off the parts to the highest bidder is just a furthering of this trauma that people are already experiencing. And I think that helped illustrate it really well. By the end of the book, there was just a lot more going on. Obviously, it was really an exploration of a capitalist and the whole military machine in the States. The military industrial complex is the word I was looking for. It's really good. It's really good. I want everyone to read this. I will talk about this more in a video I think I'm planning on making sometime soon. I just want to read a few more books for that. But this is a book I think everyone should read. Honestly, I think it's really insightful into how a lot of situations that we take for granted today got to the point where they are. And I think it really just demonstrates this general idea that like the world does not run the way we think it does. We are not governed by our governments, we are governed by corporations essentially. And this really just further demonstrates that to me. And it's depressing, but it is really eye-opening, and I would really recommend this, honestly. I give this like a 5 out of 5 stars. It was a very dense read, but I absolutely loved it. Loved it. So in a completely different vein, but another 5-star read, I have Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. I finally finished this in May. I'd read a chunk of it in April, so I briefly touched on it in my wrap up then, but I finished it in May. It was fucking fantastic. This is about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which was a long conflict and a very bloody conflict between loyalists who were loyal to the British throne and people who were loyal to Ireland and who hoped to see a united Ireland. And this is not a conflict I knew a lot about because we just don't hear about it that much here in Canada, despite the fact that there are a lot of Irish immigrants here. I feel like I should have heard more about this. A lot of people fled from Ireland to Canada because we were more accepting of different religions and different creeds. This was just really eye-opening to understand both sides of the conflict, much more so the IRA side, the Irish Republican armies. This closely followed several key players in the IRA, and there was just a ton of interviews to back this up, and it was just so well done. Patrick Radden Keefe's writing is A1. I can 100% see now what everyone has been talking about for years. His writing is unmatched. This was so easy to get through because you just get lost in his prose. It is so stunning. So good. But beyond that, it was just absolutely fascinating, and he did a really good job of not like morally grandstanding or moralizing on anything, but he really just made you feel all these emotions for the people in this book. This book is pitched often as the story of a mother who disappeared. She had like 10 kids, and one day someone just like knocked at her door and took her away, and she was never seen again. While that is a kind of framing device for the story, you kind of follow the story of her and the kids throughout a period of like 30 years. It's not the main story, which I kind of liked because there wasn't enough there for a full story, but it helped put a very personal spin on people who were tangentially related to the conflict but really didn't have much to do with it, which I really appreciated, because I feel like often in historical books you see a lot of the impact on the leaders or people who are directly involved in the conflict, but for most of the regular people involved, there's not a lot of their stories because they're just cannon fodder or they're just in the background, they're just collateral damage. But it was really nice to see the perspective of people who were directly affected but were not directly involved, which I really loved. I now will read anything Patrick Radden Keefe writes. I have his other book, Empire of Pain, which is about the Sackler dynasty and the they're the family that founded Purdue Pharma, I think. So that's one I'm really interested in, not only for the subject matter, but now also because of his writing, because it's just the most beautiful thing. I would recommend this to absolutely everyone. I loved the shit out of this. I have nothing bad to say about it. 5 out of 5 stars. Please read this if you are at all interested. It is a really interesting perspective on a conflict that we hear a little bit less about here in North America, and I really think it is a really unique perspective on British colonialism that I've never seen before. And it's a really recent conflict too, which was just really great to learn about, just to give context for a lot of current sentiments and the plight of a lot of people that are still living through the trauma of this. Would 100% recommend. Now we're gonna get into the fantasy, and there's a lot. I'd already talked about the Bone Shard Emperor, which I finished at the beginning of the month of May, but I kind of stuck it into the other wrap up. But that was also like kind of in this month. And beyond that, there are 4 other books stacked in front of me. I had a crazy reading month, so we're gonna kind of go, you know what, I'm just gonna go in the order they're stacked in front of me. Let's start with The Time of Contempt. This is the 2nd book in the main story arc of the Witcher series, but this is the 4th book that I have now read. This is still my comfort series. I'm absolutely obsessed with it. That hasn't changed, to be quite honest with you. This book, like all the others, I also gave 4 stars, and I've come to like a weird realization that as much as I personally love these books, I can't seem to be able to give them more than 4 stars because there's always something a little bit off about them. There's always something I don't quite like in terms of the actual execution of the book and the writing and the plot structure and everything. And these are also not books for everyone, so I feel kind of weird like recommending them wholeheartedly, but I really do love this series. There's so much about it that I love, especially the characters. Like I've been saying, this is such a good instance of found family. This is such a beautiful example, and it's really found family in the sense of like father figure, mother figure, and child. And I find that really beautiful, but also all the friendships that happen along the way, the relationships, romantic and platonic. There's so much in this in terms of the character work, and that is the strongest part. I feel like the general premise that we all know of Geralt being a monster hunter is definitely less visible in the books, which is really interesting because I feel like, given my knowledge of the world prior to the books, which was just the Witcher 3 video game, which was very heavily focused on monsters. Obviously, video games have to have a huge combat element, but you were fighting a lot of monsters, and I felt like that was more the vibe in the books, and in the short story collections, it definitely was. But in the last 2 books, it's definitely been more political and plot heavy and military and more like human centric rather than monster centric. And I feel like I'm kind of missing the monsters a little bit, but I also realized that I feel like there has to be a lot of setup to get to more monsters, if that makes sense. And it's not like we're not getting monsters, but like Geralt didn't fight any monsters in this. Ciri fought a monster. Like it's just kind of funny to me that I've always been touting this and everyone's been touting it as Geralt the monster hunter, but there's not a lot of monster hunting happening. I also feel like now in this book, at least, we've kind of established what the actual plot is, because in the short story collections, obviously it's a set of short stories, but I couldn't even tell you going into the first one, Blood of Elves, what the plot is, and I can kind of do that now. Basically, war is brewing, and there is already these like shifty alliances and mistrust between humans and non-humans, so like elves and dwarves, but there's also this sentiment of like political turmoil and also this magical turmoil, and Ciri finds herself in the middle of it. She has been orphaned, but right before she was born, actually, Geralt made a deal with her parents that he would be able to take her away and train her as a witcher. Witchers are monster hunters, and they're slowly dying out as a breed, so he wants to have a child to be able to train to continue his line of work. He sees himself as a very moral person, and he really believes in the creed of the Witcher. So he comes back and takes Ciri away to Kaer Morhen. The problem is Ciri not only is just an orphan, but she's the orphan of a very prime piece of political landscape of Citra, and a lot of different nations want to get their hands on Ciri for their own political and military gain. So Ciri is being hunted from all sides. There is all sorts of magical and political mischief. There are assassins of every kind. There are tons of mages and magicians and witches involved. And Ciri is not only an orphan that's being hunted because of her political need, but she's also extremely powerful. She is a child of the elder blood. So she has some extremely like world-changing abilities hidden inside her. So it's just slowly developing into this big mess, and I'm here for it. And by mess, I mean there's just a lot happening. Obviously, there's so many people and factions involved, This book is really fantastic. I think all the books have been fantastic in terms of the POVs and the way, like the story structure, the way that the story is structured, because it's not traditional in that Geralt is our main character and everything happens through his eyes. There's really clever use of switching POVs. There's really clever use of dialogue and time jumps. So I'll give an example where Geralt is laying in bed with Yennefer, his witchy love interest, and she is asking him to tell her what happened in his meeting with a sorcerer. And he is telling her very small snippets we see as he's laying in bed, but then there's like a paragraph jump and then we see in real time what happens. And it just feels much more immersive than just like him recounting what had happened. It feels much more interesting and it feels much more engaging. And I really enjoy these little uses and tricks with time and dialogue. It's just really, really well thought out. I did not give this a full 5 stars. Clearly I'm like gushing about it. I found it started to drag towards the end. Like the pacing in these is always a little bit off. There's always a section that just feels so unnecessarily long that like either the beginning you're struggling to get into it and then once the action hits it's fun. In this one there was so much fun stuff happening and then right towards the end there's like this whole long scene, I guess like a chunk of Ciri traveling through a desert and it's just the most boring thing. And I didn't love it. And you know, it's just a little slow, and again, I'm missing some of the magic part, but this is still like a comfort series to me at this point. I really do love it. I gave this, like I said, 4 stars because it is a favorite. I have nothing really like awful to say about these books. I still love these books, but they're just not like perfect. But I'm so excited to continue reading the series. Once we know when the live show is, I will definitely keep you guys posted, but I don't know myself yet. But do keep your eye out for that in case you have been reading along with us and you want to discuss. All right, so I'll talk about the next 2 kind of in tandem because I reread The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson and then read The Well of Ascension. Am I insane? Perhaps. I read a lot of pages this month. Like, I am very surprised with myself, not gonna lie. So if you do not know, these are the first 2 books in the Mistborn Era 1 trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. This is set in a world where there is just like these ash falls. The sun is blotted out by ash and clouds, and everyone is living under this oppressive, tyrannical ruler who is basically immortal. And Vin is a street urchin who finds herself drawn into this plot to assassinate the Lord Ruler and basically take over and create a new government where everyone is equal and no one is stuck living a life that they did not choose for themselves, basically. So the first book definitely follows a lot more of this kind of like plotting heist kind of storyline, and that is why I like this one more. Upon reread, it was still a 5-star. There's a lot about this I really, really love. I love the plot. I felt like the action was always up there. There are some characters that are in this book that are not in the subsequent books, so I love this more for their inclusion. And obviously I'm not going to say who because I don't want to spoil, but I love the character dynamics. I love the little found family everyone has in this. I just felt like the pacing was there throughout. I felt like the world building was introduced so naturally and so enjoyably because Vin realizes she is a Mistborn and gets trained by Kelsier, who is kind of the leader of this group. And he has been a Mistborn for a few years, so he teaches her as much as he can before they have to execute their plot. And you get to learn about allomancy, which is the magic that they have in this world, through her. Mistborn basically means that she's able to use all the metals available in this world and ingest them and perform magic with them, versus allomancers who can only ingest one and use one. She can do all of them. That makes her extremely powerful and valuable. Basically in this world you can ingest different metals and like push and pull on metal objects or influence people's emotions, or maybe see if people are using allomancy around you, or hide your own use of allomancy. It's really well thought out. I'm sure everyone's talked about this a million times, but I love how it was implemented in this book. It was a reread, so I'll stop gushing about it, but I loved it just as much the second time around, if not more, because I was familiar with everyone. The second book follows the events of the first book, and it is not as good. There's none of that same feeling of like high stakes of the heist type plot. It is a very different plot, and while you get a lot of the same characters minus a couple, it's just not as found family-ish. There's a lot of different things that they have to deal with. a lot of different internal conflicts, and I still loved it. I don't want to like take away from that. It just felt a little bit less fun to me. I think really the heist plotline and the characters in the first one made such a big difference. But I really did enjoy a kind of different look at the world in this one, because you are dealing with the aftermath of a revolution, and a lot of series just kind of end on the revolution, and now you're having to deal with remaining in power and how to deal with usurpers and how to deal with all the troubles that come with running a government, because it's very easy to say we're going to create a better government, but how are you going to deal with a lot of the things that the old government, no matter how tyrannical, did well? And I really enjoyed those kind of discussions and questions. There was just a lot less action in this. I was kind of slogging through the first bit. It really picked up towards the end, and I really enjoyed where it went. It is such a classic fantasy storyline that I love. Like the underlying story that kind of ramps up towards the end is just so classic fantasy of this unknown power that is calling, and then when you unleash it, what happens and what happens to the world and the person who unleashes it. I love that. I love that personally. So there's a lot of things about this I loved. It was just not quite as good as the first, just by nature of what was happening in the book, but I did still enjoy the characters, and the relationships were still there. They just weren't as good. The plot was just a little bit less exciting, but I do love this world. I have already started Hero of Ages, and I'm really, really enjoying this series, honestly. I am 100% on board with Brandon Sanderson and everything he is doing. I can see why he is so lauded. If you have never read Mistborn, I think it is a great place to start with Brandon Sanderson. I have not read any of his other series, but I can see why this one is so easy to get into, because it has that YA crossover appeal. It is just a very simple fantasy distilled to the best of the fantasy genre, the best that it has to offer, and I am 100% into all of it, and I can't wait to read more Brandon Sanderson. The last one should come as no surprise to anyone who has been on this channel for a little bit, because I am part of several read-alongs, and this was the final book in one of those read-alongs for the Live Ship Trader series, and that is Ship of Destiny by Robin Hobb. This is a fantasy series. This is about a family that is in Bingtown, which is this great like trading hub. They have a live ship, which is a ship made of wizard wood. It can become alive after 3 generations of a family die on deck. And basically, it just follows the family and like some pirates and a lot of internal political stuff in Bingtown and outside. And I feel so conflicted about this. Okay, so the day this is going up, I think if I can edit it and post it in time, we will be having the live show over on Beautifully Bookish Bethany's channel, so there will be more in-depth thoughts by everyone there. But basically, I, on quality, gave this 4.5 stars, but I didn't quite enjoy it. It's definitely my least favorite in the series, but then again, it's not. Like, I'm so conflicted on this book. Okay, I guess I'll start with the negatives. The ending, because this is the conclusion to a trilogy, obviously you can't please everyone with the ending, I know that. I just felt like some things were a little too neat for our main Vestrit family, and I kind of wish they weren't. I don't know how I feel about that. Beyond that though, this series is quite dark. I know I have been recommending it, obviously that should come with a caveat with most fantasy too, though, like you should be looking up trigger warnings, because I don't think I could list them all. I don't think I could remember them all. And this one, like the series is quite dark as per Robin Hobb. The problem with this book specifically is that there is SA, as in a lot of fantasy, but there was also gaslighting accompanied with it that was just very hard to read. Normally SA, it bothers me like as much as it does in fiction, if that makes sense. Like it's there and I don't like it, but it doesn't bother me because it's never explicit, and it is usually accompanied with the obvious like that was wrong and terrible, and usually the person dies, or at the very least there's just something else about it. But when it's accompanied with the gaslighting, it's just so hard to read. There's just something about it that made it difficult to like, it just made me like, I don't know how else to describe it. There's a French expression, ça lève le cœur. It just made me feel so uncomfortable to read about, and I guess that was the point. And that's the thing about Robin Hobb's writing, is that she's so good at writing characters and people that you can't help but feel so strongly about them. But in this case, it was just like, I struggled a little bit. It was rough. It was disgusting. And beyond that, like, I just found it a little bit slow and meandering, and there was just a lot trying to happen. It felt like she needed just a little bit more time to wrap everything up, but there quite wasn't, so it just escalated very abruptly and ended very abruptly. But there's a lot of things I loved. I loved some of the character arcs. There's a character I hated at the beginning that just got so redeemed, and I love her now. And there is so many beautiful moments between the characters and people becoming who they were meant to be, and I really loved that. I also loved how this like blew open the world, because this is set obviously in the same world as the Farseer trilogy and the subsequent series. It's all the realm of the Elderlings, and the way it just opened up all these possibilities, but it also made you realize a lot of the things that you thought were right from the first series, but now you know better because you saw it from a different perspective. And it makes the world feel so real because it was very connected to the previous books, but very subtly. It didn't feel like fan service or laziness. It didn't feel like it was just trying to like shove Easter eggs or shoehorn the other book series in. It was so subtly done that it just made the world feel that much more lived in. And that again is the strength of Robin Hobb. Her characters, her writing, and the world are just immaculate. Despite how much I still love Robin Hobb, and that has not changed, there's just something about this book specifically that didn't quite gel with me, and I am quite upset about that. Thank you very much. But it is still a series I would recommend. I do think, again, you could still start with this. I stand by that. I would not recommend starting with it, but I feel like if you know that you are a multi-POV person, if you are a multi-POV enjoyer in your fantasy and you don't think the Farseer trilogy would be for you, you could 100% start with this. Now that I've read it from start to finish, it is a contained story, but I feel like you'd get a lot more out of it if you had read the Farseer trilogy. That one is a lot slower, it is a lot denser, and it is a lot more painful, I guess, because of some of the things that happen to the main character, and because of being inside his head at all times, you get to really experience life through his eyes. But this series is a really great like start to finish ride on its own. It stands alone from the rest of the world, which I really appreciate. It doesn't feel like you have to read through the whole realm of the Elderlings to understand what is happening. And I still love Robin Hobb's writing and characters, and that will never change. She is a master at the craft. I just felt a little maybe let down by this one, especially because The Mad Ship, the second book, was my favorite. It was definitely my favorite of the series. I feel like that's a lot of people's opinions, especially people I trust, so I feel like I fall right into that as well. It was just my favorite from the plot and character perspective. There was just so much work happening in terms of setting up this book without it making feel like a setup. So I really loved this series overall. I will say the books all got from 4 to 5 stars. It is a great series. It is one that I hold very fondly in my heart. This last one was just a little bit of a letdown, but I still do absolutely love Miss Robin Hobb. That was the end. That was everything I read in the month of May. Like I said, ton of fantasy, a little bit of nonfiction. Let me know if you've read any of these, if you have any opinions on those, and let me know if you will be joining us for our live shows, because again, as I'm filming this, they haven't happened yet, which does not happen often because I feel like I've been behind lately. My social media is linked down below. You guys can always come talk to me there. Other than that, thank you so much for watching and sitting through this, and I will see you next time. Bye.